Hello and welcome back to Foreign Correspondents. It's the first week of November. I'm Moon Gun-young, joined by a wonderful panel of foreign journalists today. Welcome all to the program.
Hello.
We're now just a year away from the 2020 U.S. presidential election, which is already generating a lot of buzz on the prospective candidates as well as on the outcome of the vote and how it could impact the U.S.'s North Korea policy and relations with South Korea. Now, on this week's edition of Foreign Correspondents, we sit down with our panel of foreign journalists to talk more about next year's big election in the United States. We are now counting down to the 2020 U.S. presidential election where current incumbent Donald Trump will run for re-election. A number of Democratic candidates are also currently in the running for their party's nomination in next year's elections. What is the general atmosphere like in your countries ahead of the 2020 presidential election in the U.S.?
I mean, since Trump got elected, I feel like in French media, we got even more interested in American politics.
Yeah.
And the stakes seem higher than ever. I'm thinking, for example, in terms of climate change, like global warming. We have a president now with a global warming denier. I mean, U.S. has a president with a global warming denier. And I feel like we are the humanity at the cusp of a major disaster. And I think that, for me, that's one of the things that I'm most interested in. So that's one of the reasons why I think I hope to have a president to see an American president who can do something about that
We'll
issue.
get back onto the climate.
The Paris Agreement.
Climate
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe. Now, what about Kelly? What is it like in the U.S.? What's the ambience like?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the anxiety is quite high. I think hopes are high as well on both sides. It does feel like this is a really big divisive election. At least during my lifetime, it's probably the most important election. And I think a lot of other people older than me would agree. Both Republican and Democrat-based think tanks have projected that we'll have a higher turnout, or the highest turnout potentially on record. I don't know how true that really is, but we're talking about potentially 17 million more voters. So I think people are actually quite politically engaged this time around.
What about you, Frank? Justin Trudeau just won his second term in office. From a Canadian perspective, what is the 2020 shaping up to be like?
The free trade issue has been a big issue in Canada, as is the environment as well. So we're looking at those two issues for perhaps a shift toward a more progressive U.S. president.
Of course, just to weigh in, South Korea is also very closely watching how the 2020 presidential election in the U.S. will be shaping up to be, because a lot of South Korea-U.S. relations and U.S.'s North Korea policy will depend on who the next U.S. president will be. Now, former Vice President Joe Biden and Senators Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren have emerged as the front-running candidates for the Democratic Party. Which candidates are you keeping a close eye on ahead of the 2020 U.S. presidential election?
Well, I'm basically paying attention to the three candidates that you mentioned. For better or for worse, they really are leading the pack. I mean, pretty much every poll I've seen and then compilations of polls I've seen show Joe Biden in the lead, usually followed by Elizabeth Warren and then Bernie Sanders. Joe Biden has the most endorsements in the political sphere right now. It's not surprising either, honestly, out of all of the people who are running in the primaries. These are three names that we know. They are somewhat legacy candidates. They are really good at using social media. I mean, Joe Biden is a meme and has been even before he ran for office this time around. So I think, it's really not a surprise. And unfortunately for some of the other candidates that originally got buzz, like Pete Buttigieg or Andrew Yang, I do think that they're going to continue to fade out of the picture.
Now, if you could conduct an interview with with one of the Democratic Party candidates, who would it be and why?
For me, it would be Bernie Sanders. And my question would be for him, are you going too far left to move yourself out of potentially becoming president? And do you think it's effective for you to push such sort of strident progressive policies that may alienate those potential fence sitters that could vote Democratic. I'd be along those lines, sort of challenging him on some of his views to get him to flush that out a bit and maybe come up with some ideas that could move those fence sitters toward the Democratic Party.
I would choose Elizabeth Warren. I think among the three frontrunners, she's the one I think who has more chance to beat Trump in case there's an election. And my question as a French journalist would be really about a foreign policy, everything that could affect me as a citizen living abroad. For example, about global warming, about what were the plans to regulate the GAFA, Google, Apple, Amazon, Facebook, because these networks, I mean, are affecting, in France, for example, what Facebook does is affecting our news industry. The impact is very strong. And of course, as a journalist in Korea, I would ask questions about her North Korean policy. What does she plan to do in terms of dialogue with North Korea?
I mean, I would interview all three and ask them like how they plan to beat Trump. You know, what their game strategy is. Now, back in June, President Donald Trump officially announced that he would be running for re-election in 2020 under a slogan, Keep America Great.
We're going to keep making America great again, and then we will indeed keep America great. We will keep it so great. Better than ever before. We're going to keep it better than ever before. And that is why tonight I stand before you to officially launch my campaign for a second term as President of the United States.
How do you rate the odds of President Trump securing a second term in office? I mean, what are the main factors that are working in favor for his re-election chances?
I look at his odds as about 10 to 1. I think he has almost 100% chance of getting reelected. I look at the impeachment process as likely to fail and to increase his likelihood of being reelected. I look at the Democratic Party as being hampered by these the gerontocracy legacy candidates that have shown so far to be corrupt in the case of Joe Biden, with some scandals following him, and a couple of other candidates that are too far left to really have a chance.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a fortune teller, and if Trump proves something, that's very difficult with him to make any prediction. Something I noticed at a very granular level is that I saw people and I heard people saying they didn't vote for Trump in the first time, but they will vote for him because they like the fact that he does what he said, what he's promised. Even though he promised things that I think are extremely bad, like building the wall, he did that. And I think some people really like that. And he has a very strong base. And one of my concerns is that, I mean, to beat him, you need something really like attack at the jugular the way he does. It's very aggressive, and I think you need a democratic candidate like that. And I don't see between the three frontrunners, I don't see any of them being able to do that.
I mean, just to add, I mean, one predictor of potentially what we're looking at is most of the things that are controversial about Trump don't really seem to be affecting his approval rating that much. Yeah. I mean, his approval rating right now, and this is a composite of many different approval ratings, is 41%. That's not that far from Moon Jae-in's approval rating, but Moon Jae-in doesn't have an issue with, canoodling with Russia potentially, with Ukraine, putting children in what are basically camps, jails, basically. Right. We've had multiple children die in these camps, building a wall, getting ICE on immigrants, all of these really, really divisive, terrible human rights issues, the gun issue in America. These are things that you think would upset people to the point of having an approval rating lower than 41%, and it hasn't. So I think that says something about the level of numbness in the United States, but also just what Americans honestly really want a lot of the time.
According to a recent media poll in the U.S., more than half of the American public agreed that Trump should be impeached. The motion to impeach President Trump stems from the so-called Trump-Ukraine scandal, where he allegedly requested the Ukrainian president to investigate Joe Biden and his son. Now, do you believe this impeachment proceedings against President Trump could move ahead of next year's election?
I think it's possible, but I think it'll fail in the end.
No, I don't think he will pass the Senate. I mean, there is the Republican majority at the Senate. And what is very striking for me, and I mean, the most interesting thing with this Ukraine scandal is that the Republicans stick with him. They completely lost their moral compass. I mean, whatever he does, as long as he bring conservative judges to the Supreme Court and give tax benefits to the wealthiest, the Republicans seems happy to keep him. And the fact that probably won't vote for his impeachment at the Senate level says a lot.
And even recently rallied to his defense, impeding some of the impeachment process and kind of ambushing some impeachment hearings that were taking place. And I think that's really curious. And it's pure politics. It's got nothing to do with any moral high ground, any ethics. Whether Trump was right or wrong has nothing to do with that. It's pure politics in terms of the Republican congressman behavior.
I mean, so I agree with all of this, but one factor that I think is getting left out often is just that we actually don't really know how to impeach somebody. I was reading about, these proceedings and how basically the Democratic Party is trying to put together a review of how the process works and what the legality is. Supposedly it's only been attempted a couple of times in American history. And, with all the lawyers we have in the United States, they're not exactly specializing in impeachment because there may be never an opportunity to use that knowledge in their lifetime. So actually right now, a lot of that footwork is just understanding how it's done.
Right.
And given the fact that the election is next year, and it can also be used, as Frank mentioned, as a leveraging point for the Republican Party, this idea that they're being witch hunted, I really question if we're going to see progress on that, to be honest.
As the most powerful country in the world, the U.S. is always under the global spotlight during the election season. South Korea is, of course, also keeping a close eye on the election results, as it could have a significant bearing on Washington's future North Korea policy. To his credit, President Trump has done his part to make substantial progress with North Korea, shaking hands with Chairman Kim Jong-un during the historic North Korea-U.S. summit in June 2018. Now, if you could grade Trump's North Korea policy from a scale of A to F, what would it be?
I think you need to ask who's doing the grading and who it's for. I think if you're an American, it's going to be an A or an A plus even. He hasn't given up the high ground. North Korea has not done a nuclear test for 2 years or a long-range missile test for 2 years. And the U.S. has given up little more than a handshake and a photo op. So from that perspective, from the U.S. perspective, certainly a very high grade. In South Korea, not so much. The South Korean government, the Moon Jae-in administration wants engagement with North Korea, and that engagement is being impeded by this U.S. hard line. North Korea similarly, they're not getting any relief from sanctions, and they've given up quite a bit to the United States. So again, I think it depends what capital you're grading.
Kelly, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I pretty much would agree. It depends what perspective you're coming from. I do think, obviously engagement is good. I do think we have seen some measurable progress just in terms of the benefits that also South Koreans and North Koreans have gotten from renewed diplomatic relations. But I question the sustainability of the current U.S. policy. And this is not necessarily a Trump thing. It's just that, can you be in negotiations without actually negotiating? So I question how long this will last, and then what the aftermath will be, if we continue as a country to not offer any concessions at all, and to push for a total and complete denuclearization first, or a denuclearization to the point of not being able to return to the former state without anything, giving up anything. I question if we're going to go into another 10-year period where things are not so great with North Korea. So it just honestly depends. I think the North Korea issue, though, is absolutely working for Trump among his constituents. And I don't necessarily know if Democrat voters are upset about Trump's North Korea policy either. Maybe they were during the fire and fury era, but certainly not now.
President Trump has praised his own foreign policy efforts, saying that without him, a war may have broken out between North Korea and the U.S. How would Trump's successful re-election impact North Korea-related issue?
I'm really worried if a Democrat comes back at the White House to see a return of this strategic patience policy, because I think that was not a good policy. It just helped North Korea to continue to build up its nuclear and ballistic program. So that's my only concern. I do hope that if there is a Democratic president, they somehow build on what Donald Trump managed to do so far. But I don't really believe
So
they
Trump
will.
legacy on North Korea policy.
Yeah, I mean, you have to say that. I mean, I think it's good that he went to North Korea, that he crossed the line and he met Kim Jong-un 3 times. He's changing, he's trying to change the way even US is presented in North Korea propaganda. I mean, I think that was good.
In the run-up to the first North Korea-U.S. summit on June 2018, President Donald Trump and Chairman Kim Jong-un traded threats of war and personal insults, escalating tensions between Pyongyang and Washington. However, following the historic Singapore summit, the two leaders have since toned down the rhetoric, with President Trump even saying that he had fallen in love with the North Korean leader. Do you think North Korea and Kim Jong-un is secretly hoping for a re-election by Trump?
I do. I think, North Korea is obviously frustrated with Trump in the U.S., but I think, they see him as a malleable opportunity. Many people have talked about how North Korea supposedly views its relationship with the United States really as a relationship with Trump. I think that's kind of an astute thing to say. Certainly, North Korea has a strategy here, and if we get a Democrat in office, I think they're going to be confused about what the next move is. They might predict, like Frank mentioned, going back to kind of an Obama-era policy or pre-Obama-era policy, and basically starting from scratch again. And they're not wrong for thinking that. I would say probably the majority of Washington is against engagement anyway. I don't think Republicans particularly feel pro-engagement, Republican politicians. It's a Trump thing. So if Trump's gone, that leaves a lot of questions for all of us.
Yeah, I completely agree with Kelly on this. Trump is a much stronger executive, I think, perhaps than the U.S. has had in the past, and able to make that kind of outlier decision, which would be, for example, non-aggression pact with North Korea, official declaration of the end of the war, a peace treaty with North Korea, and perhaps even relief from sanctions if things changed quite a bit after his re-election. If it's a Democratic president, that type of ground-changing shift in American foreign policy toward North Korea is likely to be off the table.
I mean, I agree with you, but I will play devil's advocate. I see Trump as a double-edged sword. There is, remember before the dialogue situation where Trump was insulting North Korea, threatening war, that situation was very tense. And I think North Korea should be concerned about having at the White House a president that is, I think, unstable, that is not listening to his advisors, that can take decisions like this, even they are very damaging to its own national security. I'm thinking of the Kurds, for example, the sudden U.S. pullout of Syria that was very damaging to its Kurd allies, and it seems that Trump took this decision without consulting with anybody. I think for North Korea, it's dangerous to have Trump at the White House. Things can turn out bad pretty quickly.
Well, in terms of the Syria decision, I think that might be more reason for the South Korean government to have some concerns about its relationship with the United States rather than the North Korean government. And still, I think that it does open up an opportunity. When we had the talk of war in 2017, those insults back and forth, I still felt that there were people in place, institutional checks and balances within the U.S. military establishment that would prevent some type of large-scale conflict on the Korean Peninsula, and that most of what Trump was doing was a lot of hot air to move things towards negotiations or to pressure North Korea, again, into a more sort of different dynamic.
Okay.
Well, there seems to be definitely a personal relationship going on between Kim Jong-un and President Trump. So hopefully, they'll re-engage and move things forward. So where do the Democratic Party presidential candidates stand on the North Korean issue? In May, former Vice President Joe Biden blasted North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, calling him a tyrant and that President Trump was wrong to embrace a dictator. But Biden, alongside Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, have all said that they were open to meeting the North Korean leader if they were elected to the Oval Office. Now, if a Democratic Party candidate wins in the election, what changes could be brought to Washington's North Korea policy? Back to strategic patience, or what could it be? What can we predict?
I think part of the problem with this is that clearly the Democrats are afraid to talk about what their real plan is. I think they see this as a very divisive issue. They know that if they make commentary that's too detailed, that there's going to be 1,000 think pieces out there talking about how they're either going to end the planet or continue some kind of peace strategy. So it's hard to really gauge. On one hand, when I look at Sanders and Warren, I see people who are reformists on many levels. They want to, or at least, they plan to, cause this huge upheaval within the United States. I don't know if that mentality carries over to the North Korea issue. I also think there's a lot of social righteousness and pressure on them to be socially righteous in a way that we've kind of already given up on Trump, right? So if they meet with Kim Jong-un, in some ways they are kind of complicit with the human rights abuses, which is honestly part of their platform, right? Is that they're against people being treated badly. I can't say that's part of Trump's platform. So it's a tough line to walk just from a branding perspective. And so during the campaign, it's kind of a bind for them to really make detailed commentary. And I'll be interested to see if we see more of that during the debates. But I think it's absolutely possible that they could just go back to kind of this strategic patience.
Right. I was just amazed how little we hear about their planned North Korea policy from these Democratic frontrunners. So perhaps that's why, the reason why Kelly said, because they're afraid of the backlash they'll be receiving.
There have been few sort of candidates and politicians that will say things openly that are going to offend anybody. Trump is an exception to this. He doesn't mind offending some people, and that his sort of tendency to speak freely that way brings people out to his base and brings them supporters. You don't find that in the Democratic candidates or generally in politicians. So they're going to be careful not to alienate people. On North Korea, it's one of those issues that's way down the list of what's important to American voters. So definitely on that issue, they're not going to say something that's going to offend people because coming out with details about their North Korea policy or some grand plan isn't going to bring them a whole bunch of support. But saying something offensive is going to cost them voters.
Right. Will backfire at them. Now, South Korean President Moon Jae-in has been keen to build a personal rapport and discuss North Korea issues with his U.S. counterpart, having met Donald Trump on 9 separate occasions. Do you believe the results of the U.S. presidential elections could also influence Seoul's North Korea policy as well?
Yes. Democrats at the White House that is less inclined to dialogue with North Korea. I think for the Blue House here, it won't be such a good thing. And I'm thinking as well about the question of the financial contribution of South Korea to the presence of American military forces here.
Defense cost sharing.
Yeah,
Act, yes.
And Trump is extremely aggressive on that, to say the least. Is really. I think he's weakening the alliance a lot by pushing basically to act as a mercenary. I'm sorry, but I don't have other words to describe his position. So I think he's weakening the alliance, and that will have, in fact, an impact on the North Korean policy.
Yeah, I sort of agree with that, Fred. I think that South Korean President Moon Jae-in is going to continue with his engagement policy toward North Korea. After all, under Trump, a Republican president, early in his period in office, the South Korean president, again, pursued engagement and North Korea policy independent of what was going on in the United States, and I think he'll continue to do that regardless of who gets in office. What will change and what is going to be a dynamic in that is South Korea-U.S. relations, and as Fred mentions, the cost-sharing agreement, the OPCON transfer, and potential coordination on other related issues like the provision of aid to North Korea. So there could be some influence there, but I don't think that Moon is, again, going to change that very strong engagement strategy toward North Korea, regardless of what happens in the U.S. election.
And remember, there is a South Korean presidential election to follow after the 2020 U.S. presidential election. So that will also play in as a factor in this North Korea game. Now, final question. If you could describe your forecast on the 2020 U.S. presidential election as a news headline, what would it be?
I would pose mine as a question. I would say one of America's most important elections, comma, but who will show up to vote? Because I think that's one of the biggest questions we have when we're talking about this election.
My headline would be U.S. presidential election, why it's so important for the world.
Trump for life.
Trump for life.
With the question mark. Half a dozen times he's indicated his interest in serving perhaps for 10 or 14 years more. So I don't know, the following punctuation mark might be a little different depending on your outlet, but I think that'll get some clicks.
All right. Well, I'll just keep it at Trump another 4 years in office. But okay, we'll stick with Frank's Trump for life for him. Well, that wraps up our preview of the 2020 U.S. presidential election. We will be back next week for another discussion on the latest issues making headlines. So do not forget to tune in then. Thanks for watching and bye-bye.